Hello and welcome to the Schedule Breaker. A new nation has been released for Dominion 6 and I wanted to get right into them and my thoughts about them. Bear in mind, this is my opinion of them, only playing them for about a week, a little bit less, so don't take my word as gospel. At the time of recording, Zan has also made a great video covering the nation if you don't have the time to sit through all this. Hearing different opinions on how Dominion nations play will help you become a better player in the long run. So with that, let's jump into a nation overview of Late Age Pyrene, the Cambion Kings. The nation of Pyrene is, much like many nations of the Late Age, absolutely corrupted with blood magic. Their nobles are demon spawn of human and incubi or succubi, and they are powerful mages and combatants. The rest of Pyrene society is based kind of off the Marignons after their contact in the Middle Age. You have access to classic fantasy units like swordsmen and crossbowmen, as well as knights and demons on goats. Just your typical affair in fantasy. Your priests are average with access to holy twos, but all but one of your mages are sacred, and you can perform blood sacrifices. In terms of magic, you're mainly focused on glamour and blood magic, with some paths in air and a little bit in earth and fire, with a small chance of getting nature as well. Your starting fortification is a CP3 fort, which is nice for getting out your mages early, and you do have a turmoil limit of +1, which does limit your ability to go order scales. So let's go over your basic races as Pyrene. All of Pyrene's regular humans are descendants of the Berkrydes, the cavemen of early age Pyrene. Because of this, they all have partial dark vision, mountain survival, and some cold and fire resistance as well, 5 a pop, as well as a higher than average human strength, though for this they have lower precision than normal humans and below average magic resistance. Your demon spawn on the other hand are more fire resistant, with perfect dark vision, with even more strength and above average magic resistance, but they are demons, so they are vulnerable to smite demon from enemy holy twos. They aren't undead however, so you don't need to worry about banishments. Okay, so let's start with your troops. You have a basic assortment of medieval style troops, very similar to Marignon's lineup. You do not have access to any foreign recruitable troops. As a whole, your guys have above average morale and cost a balanced amount of gold, resources and recruitment points. Their map movement isn't the best, though they all have mountain survival, so actually you do alright in things like highlands and mountains. They do have lower than normal magic resistance however, so they may struggle later into the game when more mages get online. Also, with their heavyish armour, they have quite a lot of encumbrance which will start to ramp up pretty quickly during combat and lessen their stats. So first up are your crossbowmen. These guys have below average protection and precision, so they aren't the best crossbows of the age. Their higher strength is also slightly wasted with their crossbows, only adding a third of it to the damage it does. The crossbow itself is a basic crossbow, decent range firing once every 2 turns that does armour piercing pierce damage, a late age mainstay with the better technology around. While not strictly better in terms of functioning as crossbowmen, even compared to something like independent crossbowmen, these guys do have fire and cold resist 5, which makes them more resistant to evocations later on in the game. And their partial dark vision does make them perform slightly better in the darkness, more on that later. Plus, they do pretty good damage with their mace, even if their stats aren't the best for it. Next up is the Pyrenian Spearmen. These guys are pretty basic spearmen. They have a spear with average attack skill, okay protection, and a shield for dealing with the ranged firepower you're likely to see in the late age. Nothing that special about them. They do alright damage with their spear, and they can repel with it, though not terribly reliably. And their shield gives pretty good protection when they parry. A not so cheap line holder, but they do a decent enough job. The Pyrenian Footmen are a more killy front line, without sacrificing too much. Their kite shield does pretty well at not only parrying, but it also has quite a lot of protection that'll add to them, meaning these guys will last a little longer than their stats might show. Their protection is alright, and they have a slightly better than average attack skill and decent damage for a human troop to be quite honest. A pretty solid troop, but nothing special. The Pyrenian Swordsmen are an interesting choice. They're more elite, having better protection and protection 15, with a great sword that does quite a lot of damage with a decent attack skill. These guys can chop down cavalry and giants fairly well, though they will struggle against crossbow fire without a shield. If they can make contact with the enemy, 3 of these guys hitting from a square will put a lot of hurt on enemy forces. They also make pretty good buffing targets if you don't have anything else to use them on. The Pyrenian Man-at-Arms are an upgraded version of your footmen with better protection, strength, and stats. Between their resistances as well as their pretty respectable armour and shield, they're actually fairly tanky frontline troops, and can hold their own against regular forces fairly easily. They do cost the most resources out of all your troops so far, and cost 17 gold each, so they might be too expensive to use as your front line. They can serve as bodyguards, however, and have the Bodyguard 2 feature, which makes them pretty good at being present during assassinations, something that could make them have a place when it comes to protecting your blood hunters. As your last basic troop, we have the Pyrenian Knight. These guys have a hefty price tag built into them, but they have heavy armour and good attack and defence skills. Not only that, but their horse as well is very well protected with protection 20, though it doesn't have the fire and frost resistance that the rest of your troops have. These guys are not capital only, so you can make these guys out of any fortification that you have, and you can use these as light raiders thanks to their map movement and their general prowess in combat. Very scary and quite capable of cutting through enemy armies' rear troop or archers. Now we can move on to your sacred unit, the Cambion Knight. These are demons riding intelligent giant black goats. They're quite costly in both gold and resources, but these are absolute tanks on the battlefield, both the rider and the goat having very high protection and cold resistance, with the rider also having an additional 10 fire resistance. They have a good attack skill and strength and a very respectable defense skill of 17, making the rider quite hard to take down. The black goat in comparison doesn't have quite as good stats in combat, but it has nearly 30 hit points and good protection, making the combination of them quite hard to get rid of. Between the attacks coming from the rider and the goat, these guys can deal quite a lot of damage. Not only that, but the black goat itself is sacred, and will take any bless you give them, which can further increase their killing power as a unit, or alternatively, their durability. We'll go over more about this when we talk about blesses. So what can we take away from your troops? Well, they're fairly basic, and you don't have the deepest choice available, especially compared with some other nations. But you have line holders in your spearmen and footmen. You have crossbows for range damage, which are very useful in the late age as more troops have better armour than previous ages, and some good damage dealers in your swordsmen, knights, and sacred goat riders. Unlike some other human nations, your troops will last later into the game too, thanks to their inbuilt cold and fire resistance, making them harder to evocation down with earlier research. It's not that they won't die, they are still human-sized troops after all, but it will take enemy mages more fatigue in order to do so. You can expand pretty well with your knights if you don't want to use your sacreds, and your swordsmen as well can be an effective supporting force for getting through independent armies with not that many ranged attacks. Because your troops have at least partial dark vision, going into the caves as Pyrene is also a fairly decent choice. Your troops might not have the best stats, but they will 100% wipe the floor with not great indies. Okay, let's move on to your commanders. You have a mix of both human and half-demon Cambions to recruit, as well as a little bit of foreign recruitment in provinces without a fort. Interestingly enough, some of your stronger commanders don't have good morale, so they might run, if not blessed, or without some additional items that you can forge them. Most of your mages are sacred, but they have no holy levels themselves, so you'll be relying on your 2 priests or indies to bless them. Starting off, you have the Pyrenian Scout. Same price as an independent scout, but with the fire and cold resistance you'd expect from your Berkrydes humans. They're decently stealthy at stealth 50, but they're a scout, with nothing else special really going on for them. If you can get independent ones, recruit them rather than this one, because it will use your fort turns. Next up we have the Pyrenian Castellan, a fairly basic okay commander that can lead 75 troops. He has a pretty big castle defense of 10, which is nice to have. Otherwise isn't that much different from indie commanders, except he can lead some more troops. You could use these guys as troop farriers, but you have better options for fort turns and leaders, and with no foreign recruitment troops, this isn't as important as it might be on other nations. Next up we have the Pyrenian Marquess, a good leader that can lead 100 troops that is a little more expensive than your Castellan, but he's on a horse. This has some benefits in that it gives you a little more map move for using him with things like your knights or sacreds. Otherwise, he's got decent stats and HP, and you could use him to lead small raiding parties with some additional knights as a retinue, kind of similar to a Black Lord and Black Knights of Middle Age on, though they do have less protection than them, so you'll probably need more of them. A good guy to lead your regular troops. Next we have the Pyrenian Priest, a Blood 1, Holy 1 sacred human mage. They're actually okay leaders, which is nice in letting them ferry around some troops or lead some sacred expansion parties. They can bless your sacred troops, and with Blood 1 can do some basic blood magic or join Sabbaths. Given the relatively cheap cost for the late age, they can make up some nice early blood hunters if you find some good provinces to help them get your blood economy going nice and quick. They've got terrible protection, so keep them at the back away from arrows, and additionally the morale actually leaves a lot to be desired. Though when they bless themselves they do go up to 10, which isn't great, but not as bad as it would be otherwise. You can use them as researchers, and they're not the most efficient, but it's still a good choice as a workhorse mage for the nation. Next up we have the Cambion Count, a Blood and Glamour 1 Sacred Demon on one of your big black goats. While there's not much cross paths with Blood and Glamour, those are two paths that can still be quite useful, through some small scale buffing or through joining Sabbaths to cast bigger spells. They're good leaders, but they cannot bless themselves or their sacreds, making them not the best at actually leading expansion parties without priest support. They are Blood Searchers 1, making them count as Blood 2 for the purposes of blood hunting, which is not a bad deal to be honest if you can deal with the initial gold cost for some more reliable hunters. They can make some pretty good light thugs with some additional gear and a bless. They are inept researchers however, so keep them to active roles if you can. Next we have the Blood Bishop, a Holy and Blood 2 Glamour 1 Sacred Mage. He costs more than the Priest for about the same role, though his Glamour pass he can cast big Glamour spells in your Sabbaths. Give him a few Blood Slaves and a couple of Sacreds, and he can expand with them and a couple of Imp spawns. Again, keep him safe from arrows as he has no protection with human HP. At least his morale isn't quite as bad as the Priest's. Next up is the Cambion Countess, a Blood 2 Glamour 1 Sacred Demon Mage with an 100% chance for an additional path in either Glamour or Blood, and an additional 10% chance for a +1 in Fire, Earth, or Nature. They are a bit costly, but for it you get a pretty good Glamour or Blood Mage. You could use them for very reliable Blood Hunters with a Blood Searcher +1, but they're a bit costly for that role. Use them to buff up your troops and help lead your demons. They're also adept crossbreeders, but you don't get much use out of that as you only have a 10% chance of getting nature magic on them, so really don't rely on that. They're slow to recruit, but they are not capital only, so it makes a good idea to get a few of these in some of your other forts. Moving on to your capital only mages. Both of them are slow to recruit, expensive mages that are also demons, and they also have adept crossbreeding and blood searching. First up is the Cambion Queen, a Blood 3 Glamour 2 Sacred Mage with a 100% chance to get a +1 in Fire, Earth, or Glamour, and an additional 10% chance for a +1 in Fire, Earth, Nature, or Blood. These mages will help you get a little bit of magic diversity and have pretty good Glamour and Blood paths. The cross paths also unlock a few forging and summoning options for the nation, which we'll go over later. Otherwise, you can just use her to help you support your Sabbaths. You can blood hunt with her, but that's a pretty big cost, and you can just use other lower level mages for that. Just keep an eye on her morale, as she could run if against a lot of fear effects, being at morale 10. Finally, we have the Cambion King, a Blood 3 Glamour 2 Sacred on a goat that has a 100% chance for a +1 in either Fire or Earth, an additional 10% chance for +1 in Fire, Earth, Glamour, or Blood. Again, their crosspaths unlock a few summoning and forging options for the nation. They're also good leaders, with 150 leadership and a good morale bonus for your troops. Their own morale is lacking, however, so you need to shore them up before you could use them as combatants. Don't underestimate the power of Earth randoms. They can become quite scary thugs with some personal buffs, items, and a bless in them. Otherwise, use them in active roles if you can. They're not very efficient researchers for the price. Moving on to your foreign recruit commanders, you have two. They both require a lab to recruit, with the monks also needing a temple. You don't have any discounts on labs or temples as this nation, so it can be a little bit costly to get these foreign recruit sites up. But thankfully, you're in the late age, so you have higher pot provinces for more income. See how your expansion does, as these two can help shore up your magic and your diversity. Remember as well that having labs and temples spread out in your provinces will help your blood hunting efforts. Having a higher dominion in a province will reduce the likelihood of your blood hunters being ambushed or attacked by villagers, which the temples will help facilitate. And the labs will give you another place to drop off your collected slaves without having to run all over the map. Starting off, the Pyrenian Monk is a Glamour, Blood, and Holy 1 Sacred Mage. They're actually an interesting choice. They're very similar to your Pyrenian Priests, but with an additional Glamour path for a slightly increased cost, and they're not as efficient researchers. But they can still do other active roles as good as your Priests, meaning you have another way of getting low-level Blood Hunters out easily without blocking your fort recruitment. Use these guys for some low-level Glamour buffs for your troops, and also for blessing your forces. Otherwise, you probably want these guys either blood hunting or site searching, rather than researching. That is, unless you're willing to invest a few gems in them. More on that later. Finally, we have the Sorgina, who has fallen in power and relevance from the powerhouses of Early Age Pyrene. They are air and blood 1, with an 100% chance for +1 in fire, air, or blood. They are also able to turn into stealthy black cats for sneaking purposes, where you could use them as some stealthy raiders if you summon some air elementals. The air 2 randoms also unlock some more summoning options for you, such as hawks that you can use as patrollers for your blood hunting operations. In battle, getting buffs up like Wind Guide will help your crossbows per precision, and in Sabbath, you can get pretty far up into air. Getting an air 2 random with blood boosting item will also let you start summoning storm demons. You could use these guys for research, but because they're not sacred, they're actually fairly golden efficient for what you get out of the research. But if you need to get something quick, you've always got them as an option. So what can we take away from your mages? Well, we can see that every one of them has access to blood. You are a blood nation as Late Age Pyrene. This means that you should be using Sabbaths to cast big spells and to boost up your lower paths in fire, air, and earth. Blood also has some great buffs for you. Your sacreds and mages are demons, so giving them bloodlust to bump up their strength makes them hit pretty hard in combat, and you can actually get that fairly early. Thanks to your plentiful and easy to recruit blood access, you should also be able to get a blood economy started, probably by the end of the first year, especially if you can spend some gold to start foreign recruiting your monks. Just remember that your big mages are demons, so they can be killed by enemy priests with Smite Demon or things like Cleansing Waters, and you have no Astral to try and boost up and get anti-magic off for your mages and your sacreds. As for national summons, you technically have 2. Summon Succubus and Summon Incubus. These are identical to the Blood 5 spells you would normally have access to. But as Late Age Pyrene, you can cast these from the start of the game, and you only need to have Blood 3 in Glamour 1 instead of Blood 4 in Glamour 1. However, they still cost the same in Blood Slaves. These give you invisible flying dream seducers who are able to try and seduce enemy commanders to join your side, or kill them should they resist. If they're successful, they'll fly your new loyal subject back to safety. They're also fairly capable combatants, and have Glamour 2 if you wanted to use them for other purposes like researching or buffing your troops. Keep a very good eye out for independent commanders to seduce, for example, mages that you'll find on tier 3 thrones. Not only will getting rid of all of the commanders make the throne easier to take, but you can also get some nice mages out of the deal to increase your magic diversity. They also have 50 undead leadership to help lead any demons you might summon. After you successfully seduce a target, you now have a Cambion Progeny that can potentially spawn. The exact chance on these I'm not too sure, but it can happen now and again. They're a Blood 1 Sacred Mage, although Illwinter did say that them being sacred is a mistake, so that may be removed at some point, maybe by the time this is out, who knows. With a bunch of chances for additional paths. A 25% chance for +1 in Fire, Earth, or Glamour, and then 2 additional chances for +1 in Fire, Glamour, or Blood, with a 25% chance each. There's not great chances for additional levels, but if you're lucky enough to get a Fire or Earth 3 random, then yeah, good on you, you should probably go buy a lottery ticket. Not something to plan a build around, but hey, they're very nice to have, and they can really increase your magic diversity if you get lucky. They're also Blood Searchers +1, so you can always use them to blood hunt or for research if you don't get a lot of pass out of them. At the end of the day, getting a free mage for free is pretty nice. As for national heroes, you get 2, both of which give you some nice additional cross paths. They both also have pretty good deep path access, at least for the late age. If you can afford it, getting Fortune to get a better chance to get them can be very nice. Unfortunately, they have a fairly long minimum turn arrival time, 20 for the King and 15 for the Red Mistress, which can impact your decision a little bit. First of all, let's talk about the Crimson King, a Sacred Blood 3 and Glamour, Fire, and Earth 2 Demon Mage. He's on a goat, and he also has Dominion Immortality, making him a very nice combatant with all the paths he has. He can break you into Earth by forging Earth Boots to help your other mages, and he's a good leader for your armies, as well as a good sight searcher for the gems that you want with his paths. If you get him, great. He'll be a powerhouse till Soulslay comes out. His minimum 20 turns wait for him is pretty crushing, to be honest. Still, you can do some really nice work with a little bit of gear. The Red Mistress, on the other hand, is a very good mage, with Blood 4, Glamour 3, Fire 2, and Nature 1. This gives you very deep blood access for things like summoning, and she also has nice cross paths, including Nature. Getting her up to be able to create something like Armour of the Twisting Thorns can help any of your other blood or nature mages you can find, and with her Glamour and Nature magic, she can also help you get further into nature with spells like Fairy Courts or Fey Prince. In a pinch, she can still Dream Seduce as well, though I think she's probably too valuable to use for things like that. As for starting sites, you have two. The Cambion Estates let you recruit your Cambion Kings, Queens and Knights, and also gives you 2 Blood Slaves and 1 Glamour Gem a turn. The Cathedral of the Crimson Emerald also gives you 1 Fire and 1 Earth Gem per turn, for a total of 3 gems and 2 Blood Slaves of income from the start. That's not that bad in the late age, and Blood Slaves income is always nice for getting a little bit of a stockpile before you go out and start blood hunting. So what do you want to get out of magical research? Well, as a blood nation, you want to get blood magic research done. It will let all your mages cast more powerful blood spells, and also unlocks more powerful demon buffs and summons for you to supplement your armies with. Other than blood, however, you do also have a lot of glamour in the nation. So going down the thaumaturgy, alteration or enchantment lines will give you buffs to hand out to your sacreds or even just to your troops. The main issue that you're probably going to have is that early game glamour and blood aren't the strongest paths without some research. But you can use your limited fire and earth axes to help with that, and there are some spells that you can work towards to try and help you in your first or second war. We'll look at some of your more useful battle spells first, and then we'll talk about a little bit of thugging spells as well. First of all is the Splendor spells, needing glamour and fire. These give the affected targets all 1, which doesn't sound like a lot, but once you get later on, you have much higher AoE spells, this will really start to add up. If your troops don't get attacked as much due to having awe, then that means more of them will survive, more of them will be able to hit the enemy, and you'll probably win off that. After all, not getting hit keeps your troops alive for longer, and on your sacreds it affects both the rider and the mount, which can get pretty scary if you add it in with something like a Dread or Fear Bless as well. Luck spells are also great for your troops, sacreds, and even mages. I think it works with your communion slaves, and dodging fatigue damage, but I'm not 100% certain. Seems like it works sometimes, but not always. From my testing, I have definitely noticed them take 0 damage when it would be fatal, but it could have been something else. Otherwise, giving your troops or sacreds a 75% chance to not die if they take fatal damage is fantastic. Again, great on your sacreds or other mounted troops because it affects not only the rider, but also the mount. Suddenly, your tough Cambion Knights got even more difficult to take down. Given your wide glamour axis, this will be a mainstay buff for the entire game. To further buff your troops or sacred's defensiveness, you could use something like blur or displacement buffs to make them harder to hit in combat. Unfortunately, blur and displacement don't stack together, so choose one or the other. Blur is good as it has larger AoE spells that come faster in the research tree, but displacement is usually the better buff if you can get it. Combining this with your Splendor spells make your sacreds really difficult to deal with in melee combat, though you do still have to be wary of ranged firepower. For some blood spells, Bloodlust is an absolute no-brainer for you. Giving all of your sacred demon cavalry +4 strength is fantastic, and giving that to your other demon summons or even just imps will massively improve their damage output. Sadly, it will not affect your black goats, but if it did, that would be pretty ridiculous. Later on, Rush of Strength is good as well for your non-demon troops, but that is quite a bit later in the research tree. Speaking of imps, Summon Imps is actually a great early spell for you. It will assist you in expanding into harder to take province with just a few more blood slaves. Imps plus your Cambion Knights will do some really good work. The fact that all of your mages can cast this as well means that if you need to, dumping a bunch of blood slaves to summon tens of imps per battle round is going to do pretty well for you, especially in your first war. Sabbaths are obviously going to be very important for you going forward. All of your mages can join Sabbaths, and it's a great way to leverage your ability to recruit fairly cheap blood ones in both your fort and also outside of them. Though just be careful if you're using cross-path spells, as you may lose a few slaves if you're a little bit gung-ho at casting non-blood spells. Combine this with Rejuvenate to keep your slaves from dying from fatigue. With your Sabbaths, having your Sorginas being able to cast things like Arrow Fend or Arrow Ward will be a big help in larger battles. Given the prevalence of crossbows in the late age, your sacreds can be taken down by them, especially if they've been given things like Wind Guide or additional damage buffs like Serpent Arrows. Though, admittedly, you don't have to worry about fire arrows quite as much, given your inbuilt fire resist. Still, having an 80% chance to ignore a pretty damaging crossbow bolt is nothing to sniff at. And while you can't cast it easily, if you know you're going up against a lot of ranged firepower, get a Sabbath ready and keep this one in your back pocket. Continuing with the idea of Syringas in Sabbaths, you can also use them to help with your evocations. You can use spells like Lightning Strike for your Air 2s, or if you have a fire random, in a Sabbath, you can use spells like Sulphur Haze or Fire Cloud to do a lot of area effect fire damage. This goes really well with your troops, as all of them have at least some level of fire resistance other than your mounts. If you start doing this though, do be prepared for a little bit of slave burnout. Though you get it later in the research tree, Twilight and Nightfall in battle is very, very useful. Not only will Twilight buff up your glamour pass while it's there, but it will also give your troops an advantage. Your basic humans have half dark vision, whereas your demons either have spirit sight or full dark vision, so they only lose half or no stats from being darker. Use these spells against enemies that can't see in the dark to give your units a massive advantage in combat. Additionally, don't forget about morale plays as well. You have access to both Blood, Rain and Blood to massively reduce the enemy's morale, and using this in combination with Despair and the Thaumaturgy tree will make your enemies run much faster in battle, making it far easier to win the day, and who knows, maybe a couple of them die in their retreat. Very scary when you have a Fear Bless as well. Moving on to your thugs. If you have access to even level 1 in Earth, then that's a personal Iron Skin for a massive increase in natural protection, and with a gem, summon Earth Power for some reinvigoration. If you've got Fire randoms, Fire Shields are an obvious one, but don't forget about things like Immolation for doing quite a bit of area effect damage around you. Your Fire Resist should help keep your mages surviving, you just gotta worry about the go. If you want to rely more on your glamour paths, you want to be thinking about things you can do with glamour. Obviously using spells that we talked about before, things like Splendor and Luck, both fantastic self buffs that you can do for your thugs too. You also have access to Blur and Displacement, but also Mirror Image in order to give your thugs some ablative hits. This works fantastically with Shrouded Bewilderment, which causes anyone trying to attack your unit to have to make a magic resistance check, otherwise they cancel their strike and their next action will be a random one, potentially causing them to attack their own allies. Interestingly enough, units that can see invisible, things like Spirit Sight, don't actually fully negate this, but they do get a bonus to their magic resistance roll. You can also later cast this on your Sacred too, making them pretty durable. These are mostly Glamour and Blood spells I've talked about. But don't forget you also get some Earth, Air and Fire access, which you can help boost up using your Sabbaths. Buffing up your unit's natural protection with the skin spells will make them far tankier. Buffing up your unit's attack skill and morale through things like Gift of the Furies is another fantastic option. And don't forget, at the end of the day, you can also make a bunch of your sacreds fly with things like Gift of Flight, which will cause absolute havoc in your opponent's backline. Finally, let's talk about the new spell, Soul Transaction, a Blood and Glamour 1 spell that costs 1 Blood Slave in order to cast. This seems pretty much tailor-made for this nation, and given they both came out in the same patch, I think Illwinter thinks so too. But unlike something like Charm, it's difficult to MR negate. If successful, the target will attempt to flee the battlefield and become invisible. An interesting spell to be sure. It's just a shame about short range. With only requiring Blood 1 and Glamour 1, quite a lot of your mages can cast this, and it can be a good idea against things like enemy thugs in order to bring them on your side. Some good ideas for non-national summons will be things that you can use to increase your magical diversity. Things like summoning blue caps to then summon gnomes, to then start thinking about things like Fey Princes or Fairy Courts. Depending on whether you want to get more nature or more death access, you want to think about if you want to go cold scales or heat scales, but we'll talk a little bit of that when we go into scales. Additionally, don't forget that your Air 2 Syringas can also use Call of the Wilds to give you upkeep-free hawks that can be very, very good for patrolling in your blood hunting provinces. As for blood summons, because you'll probably have more blood slaves than any other kind of gems, that's just the way the late age works, Shadow Imps can be a really good thing to use early if you're planning on going more underground. If you can get a nature blood crosspath, crossbreeding with your adept breeders can get you some really good results. Additionally, don't forget about your Syringas, which can get Storm Demons with some boosters for some flying lightning blasters. And if you manage to boost up your Blood Earth randoms, you can also get Demon Knights, which can be a good way of supplementing your other Demon Knights, as they will also have an inbuilt Fear Aura. Finally, if you have Death on your Pretender, you can also use Curse of Blood later into the game to start summoning things like Vampire Lords, which will also help you break into death. Okay, let's move on to forging. So let's first of all talk about research boosters. As Late Age Pyrene, you actually have access to quite a few of them fairly easily. Owl Quills are an obvious one, with your Air 1 Syringas, and they can also give you a fairly good early boost in research at just construction level 3. You will however have to find some air sites in order to get the income however. A far easier booster to make will be your Imp Familiars. You should have enough Blood Slaves to start pumping these out fairly quickly for another quick research boost. If you want to use your monks for research, you can also start to make things like Dreamstone at construction level 5, which are actually pretty efficient research boosting items, plus 9 research in comparison to the Quills plus 6. And they still cost the same gems, just in Glamour instead. You do start with glamour income from the start, so it's slightly easier for you to make these, though they do come later in the game at construction level 5. Finally, you do also have access to lightless lanterns at construction level 7, but you will need a fire random to make them, and out of all the commanders you can recruit, you probably want one of your fire random Syringas to make these, rather than the more expensive Cambion Queens or King randoms. So what about some other example of items you can forge? Well, for your Cambion Kings that you want to use in battle, a Dragon Helm is a good, inexpensive option. It gives you even more fire resistance, on top of a decent helmet, and most importantly, morale. Given that your Cambion Kings wear a crown rather than a helmet, you'll want something in this slot anyway to boost up their protection, and this makes a great choice. Otherwise, if you don't want to use this, you could also use something like a Pendant of Courage to give both your Cambion King and their mount plus 5 morale, which also works quite well. Though it doesn't solve the crown problem, in that you'll still have to worry a little bit about head protection. The Soul Scales are another new item that came out in the recent patch, and they are fantastic for this nation. It gives Dream Enhancer plus 2, making them a very easy choice for giving to your Succubi or Incubi to make them be able to do their dream seductions a little bit better. Getting easier seductions means more commanders joining you, which can mean potentially more mages, which can potentially mean more magic diversity, which you would love to get. Obviously, as a blood nation, Sanguine Dowsing Rods are a fantastic choice. I've covered them before, but giving your blood hunters +1 to their blood path for the purposes of blood hunting really helps them bring in the slaves, especially for your level 1 blood hunters. You also want to think about using lifelong protections if you can. They are fairly expensive at 40 blood slaves to forge, but using them on something like your Incubi or Succubi in order to help them win assassination battles if they're discovered or the person tries to rat them out can make them far scarier. And you'll be able to more reliably either seduce people or just kill them. Either way, you win. If you're able to get the blood or nature paths to make it, Armour the Twisting Thorns is also a great way of boosting up any of your nature or blood mages to get you further up the paths in order to forge either more items or do some more summons. It does require nature 2 in order to make, so you'll need to either find or trade another nature booster for it or just empower one of your nature randoms in nature. Potentially as well, something that could be a little bit more economical given that there's far more blood slaves and gems in the late age, you could empower a nature mage you find in blood, and you can make enough blood boosters for them to get to the point where they can make this armour pretty easily. Alright, let's talk more about Pretender Designer for Late Age Pyrene. You have a pretty wide selection for pretenders from both the Greek and Celtic cultures. Alright, so let's talk more about the Pretender Designer for Late Age Pyrene. You actually have a pretty wide selection of pretenders from both the Greek and Celtic cultures available to Late Age Pyrene, as well as some of the more classic ones from Christian lore. When it comes to whether you want to take an Awake, Dormant, or Imprisoned pretender, it really depends on how strong your bless is. With a good bless, you can expand with a handful of your Cambion Knights and a Priest in order to bless them pretty reliably with little attrition. You can also expand with your regular troops if you've chosen more of a Scales build, but it's not quite as effective in my mind. Just purely from the amount of attrition you'll get from expansion, your expansion won't be quite as good. Speaking of Scales, let's go through them. For Late Age Pyrene, Dominion is actually quite important. 1, to reduce the chances of your blood hunters getting assassination attempts while blood hunting, and 2, for your sacred production. Not only are your sacred troops very good, but every single mage you can make in your capital is sacred. This means you're going to be quite limited for holy points when it comes to recruitment, especially seeing as you have a 3 commander point fortification from the start of the game. With a Dominion of 7, you can make 2 of your mages and 5 sacreds a turn at maximum production, resources allowing obviously. This will allow you to get a good mass of sacreds, as well as mages to start getting your blood economy up, and making sure that you can bless your sacred troops. Anything lower than 5 Dominion, you're starting to get to the point that you won't be able to get enough of your sacreds out in time for your first war, and you'll instead have to rely on your okay, but not exceptional troops. When it comes to order, Pyrene has a turmoil scale of +1, so you're limited to only having 1 order at maximum unless you pick a pretender that negates that. Order is nice on the nation, you like the recruitment points for your non-sacred cavalry, and it does help keep the unrest down while blood hunting. However, you can actually go turmoil if you can handle the unrest, and you just want more points for your bless, but you will need to spend either more gold for patrollers or more gems for upkeep free patrollers in order to compensate that in your blood hunting territories. Also, you'll lose a little bit of income, but it's late age, I think you'll be fine. Production is slightly more important for Pyrene. Your Cambion Knights, as well as your normal Pyrenian Knights, cost a fair bit in resources. And even then, your base troops aren't the cheapest, so probably getting at least level 1 is a good idea. Sloth, for that same reason, I wouldn't actually recommend. You'll be quite resource limited for quite a lot of your recruitment, especially in your capital. And unlike other nations, you don't have an easy way to be able to increase the amount of resources produced in a certain province. When it comes to temperature scales, your nation actually prefers a neutral temperature scale. But given the fact that all of your units, bar your goats, have fire resistance, heat scales actually seem like a good way of getting more points for your pretender. You do have to decide though whether or not you want to summon Unseelie in order to get death access. If that is the case, then cold isn't bad for you either. You do lose a little bit of map move, but all of your units, including your goats, also have cold resistance. So the world's really your oyster in terms of temperature. Go whichever way you want and what you prefer. Just be prepared if you go cold, you lose a little bit of map movement on a nation that's already fairly limited to their map movement, but you do get the chance of getting some good death summons later into the game. Growth death is a tricky one. You're a blood nation, so you like growth. You cannot easily cast Blood Fecundity in your blood hunting provinces, you require lucky random paths or empowering, so you can't really rely on it in the same way a nation like Mictlan does. Remember as well that in the late age you're more likely to find provinces with more people in it, so the percentage increases to population growth or loss are more impactful. At the same token, if you're wanting to focus less on your blood economy and more into your stronger sacreds, going Death 1 isn't really the end of the world. But you will start to run out of places to blood hunt unless you keep conquering your neighbours, especially in a longer game. But at the same token, you can invest those design points by taking Death 1 to make either your sacreds or your other scale stronger so you can win those early wars. Fortune or Misfortune is another one I'm kind of torn about. You have two very good heroes that Fortune helps bring. Additionally, getting gem events is far more valuable in the late age than any other age, and Fortune will help a lot with that. You could even potentially dump Turmoil to 3 and take Fortune 2 and try and see if you get lucky in that regard. Otherwise, if your pretender already shores up your magic diversity issues, then leaving it neutral or taking 1 in Misfortune can get you the extra design points if you really need it. Finally, again, Magic or Drain is a tricky one. Magic scales are nice to help shore up your foreign recruit mages so their inept researcher doesn't hurt so much and to make your priests even more efficient. But you can already make some fairly cheap research boosters to make up for that. Your troops will also have even less magic resistance in your lands as well, which is bad as your humans have poor magic resistance already and your demons will be less resistant to smite demons. On the flip side, going Drain reverses what I've just said, so really it's up to you what you prefer. I think given that you probably want to use a lot of smaller researchers, mages without that much research, going magic is preferable, but it's really up to you and what you can afford. Alright, let's chat blesses. What are some things to consider? Well, first of all to remember, all of your sacreds don't have magic weapons. This means they're going to struggle against things like mist form or ethereal enemies come the mid-game, so a magic weapons bless isn't off the cards in order to keep them relevant later in the game. Barkskin is another option for increasing your unit's natural protection. You'll struggle to cast it natively, and all of your sacreds have 10 heat resistance, so only going down to 5 isn't the worst thing for +7 natural protection. At the same token, Hardskin doesn't do as much for your demons, but it is better for your goats, and it will scale better when you start getting things like your groupstone skins off in order to help buff up your sacreds. A special note should be given to Fear or Dread. They are excellent on mounted sacreds. The auras apply to both the rider and the mount, so you can stack it fairly well with your size 5 sacreds. With around 6 of them fighting independent forces, it's actually impressive how quickly they'll just start to run away from failing their independent morale checks. And as you get more sacreds, it'll have more of an effect, and it can actually turn the tide of some battles. It's expensive, but getting a Quickness Bless on your troops is also an option. You don't have any way to cast Quickness natively, so getting it on your Bless gives your sacred troops a massive boost to their killiness, and it increases their already pretty good defensive levels to that of elves. You will have to sacrifice something in order to get it, scales or magic diversity, but it can be a very strong choice. If you're wanting to spend some points to get some resistances for your sacreds, poison resistance would be a good one. You can at least get some shock resistance out of your Syringas when you empower them up through your Sabbaths, but you don't have any easy way of getting poison resistance out without empowering in nature. When spells like Foul Vapours or Serpent Fangs come out, your big beefy sacreds will start to die easily unless you can get a nature random that's able to join your Sabbath and cast something like Purify Blood. If you want to use a lot of demons with your forces, it's actually probably not a bad idea to get Undead Command. It's fairly cheap to get and it'll let your sacreds move your demons around far better. Equally, Inspirational Presence isn't the worst either, and will let your sacreds ferry your troops and lead them better in combat. For blesses I would stay away from, one would actually just be Blur. It can give you a nice early game boost for your Sacred Knights, but you can cast the spell so easily with all your glamour magic, I feel like you can use the bless point somewhere else. I would also say the same thing for the larger bless. It will make your sacreds able to take damage a little bit better, which is nice with their inbuilt resistances, and it also makes your Sabbaths last a little bit longer, but it does knock your knights from being size 5 on their mounts to size 6, having your attack density to only 2 attacks per square. So it is a pretty big trade-off. Okay, that was just some general thoughts about blesses. Let's move over to some example pretenders. Okay, let's start off with an Awake Expander Dragon. He's a Fire 7 mage with Flame Shield, as a bless, with Dominion 6, Order and Production 1, and Heat 2. Because of his Fear Aura built into his chassis, on top of the Flame Shield and his multiple attacks including his Flame Breath, he can actually deal with most regular independent forces, though be careful about sending him up versus Crossbowmen. Use an Awake Pretender like this to help expand in the early game to get enough gold for your expensive commanders and also to get your infrastructure up. The Flame Shield will be on both your Cambions and their goats, which is quite a lot of HP for the enemy to go through, and they might just kill themselves trying to strike him. For a slightly larger bless, you could go with this Awake Statue of the Underworld, who has Death 8 and Glamour and Blood 4, with a Stygian Flesh and Fear Bless with 8 Dominion, 1 Order and Production, 2 Heat, and Misfortune, and 1 Drain. The scales here are slightly less than optimal. You can play around with these if you'd like to get what you prefer. But for it, you get a very good Incarnate Bless right out the bat. Much tougher Sacreds with an inbuilt Fear Aura means you can just send out 5 to 6 Cambion Knights with someone to bless them, and you'll expand without attrition. The 10 invulnerability is really nice for your mages too, to protect them from things like random crossbows. Just be wary about fighting things with magical weapons. For another Awake Incarnate, we have the Oracle, a Water 9, Glamour 3 mage with a Quickness and Heroism Bless, with 7 Dominion, 1 in Production, 2 Heat, and 1 in Magic. This bless is simple. Give your Sacred Knights Quickness and let them rip through the enemy. A slight Heroism Bless also helps them get some experience, and I wouldn't say you've got good scales, but you certainly haven't got bad scales. You could take this as a template to go harder if you'd like to by getting worse scales for even more of a bless, and if you really want to, dip into death scales, get some horrible Hell Bless with Quickness, and just rush your first enemy. Next up we have a pretty basic Dormant Protector Titan, with a 6 in Nature, 4 in Glamour, and 2 in Earth, with a Barkskin, Reinvigoration, Heroism Bless. His scales are 7 in Dominion, 1 in Order, 2 in Production, 2 in Heat, 1 in Growth, nothing in Fortune, and 1 in Magic. And while his Barkskin doesn't kick in until he's up, you aren't reliant on Priests for your Cambion Knights to expand, though they will need some additional forces to properly help them. A slower expansion than the previous ones, but the Reinvigoration and Heroism will also help your mages get experience faster and deal with Sabbaths better without sacrificing your scales. Next, for an Imprisoned Rainbow, we have the Freak Lord, with a level 3 across the board in all paths except for Astral 4 and Blood 5. For his bless, we have Blood Surge, Enchanted Blood, 3 times Undying, 3 times Reinvigoration, and Poison and Shock Resistance. For his Dominion, we have Dominion 6, Order 1, Production 1, Heat 2, nothing in Growth or Fortune, and 2 in Magic. This bless is to help shore up some of the resistance weaknesses our Cambrians have, while giving them a little killing power with Blood Surge. I've actually found that they'll quite often kill an enemy unit with their Lance Charge, which will then trigger the Blood Surge. Additionally, it also gives them a little bit of regeneration through the Enchanted Blood and Dying combo, and this combo also helps our Sabbath Slaves stay alive, as well as Reinvigoration 3 to help all of our Sacred Mages with their fatigue. At Magic 2, our research has become quite a bit more efficient, which should help us stay in the research game while our Pretender is sleeping. And once he's out, will have some good magic diversity, but that'll be quite late in the game, so it'll probably just be there to summon vampire lords. Finally, for a little bit more of a Hellblessed, we have the Baphomet, who has Fire 8, Astral and Blood 6, Bearable Splendor, Stygian Flesh, and a Blood Surge Bless. For his scales, we have Dominion 7, Turmoil 1, Heat 2, Death 2, Misfortune 2, and Drain 2. These scales are pretty bad, but we haven't taken Sloth, otherwise we'll struggle to produce our Sacred Knights, and the whole reason for this bless. Between the invulnerability from Stygian Flesh and the unbearable Splendor, our Cambions will just not take that many hits at all, and the Blood Surge gives them just enough killiness to be able to wipe out the foes against you. You need to try and win hard and fast with this kind of pretender. These scales will come back to haunt you before too long, especially that Misfortune 2. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this look into Late Age Pyrene. As I said at the start of the video, I am nowhere near an expert on this nation. They came out very recently, so it'll be a while before people get settled on what's good and what's not for the nation. These are just my opinions. If there's something I've missed, and I'm almost certain that I definitely have, please let me and the others know in the comments section. Additionally, watch and read what others think of the nation. Different minds think differently for solving problems, and at the heart of it, Dominions is a problem game. And they'll have thought of strategies that I haven't, and it'll help you understand this new nation better and become a better player. Either way, thank you very much for watching. If you like the channel and you like what we're doing, consider becoming a member for some additional benefits. But until next time, take care.